So just as a heads up to everyone. But Dr. Gladstone, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. So my postdoc trajectory is a little bit different and pretty unusual, I think. So I applied to a couple of postdocs at the end of grad school. I got one position that would require me to move, and then another position that wouldn't have actually been a postdoc because I hadn't graduated yet. And for those that don't know, my husband is also an academic in developmental psych, and he is 2 years ahead of me in terms of like trajectory wise. And so he got a postdoc at NYU. And so once he got that postdoc, I started looking for opportunities also at NYU and reached out to some people to see what opportunities would be there for me. And at the time, I was hitting and or swinging and missing, basically. And then an opportunity came up with Dr. Andre Simpian, who I had talked to previously about a postdoc position. At the time, there wasn't any funding for me, and he was already writing grants with other people, so I couldn't write a grant with him. And so he offered me this position with a slight problem. I had not graduated yet and was not planning on graduating at that time. I'd gotten a dissertation fellowship and was just planning on staying at Maryland for another year. But I got a blessing from my grad advisor, Dr. Alan Wigfield, to go ahead and do this position with Dr. Andre Simpian at NYU. So for the first year of my first postdoc, I was a research scientist until I graduated. And I graduated right as the pandemic hit, which is a wonderful time, as I'm sure you all remember. So much confusion. So once I graduated, my title switched from research scientist to postdoc. And so I spent that year as an official postdoc working remote because all of our offices closed and everything like that. And because of the pandemic, my funding for the following year with Dr. Andre Simpian was pulled because it was heavily reliant on being able to get into schools, which was just not going to happen. So once it became clear that there was going to be no funding for me at NYU, I started to look for other postdoc positions. I wasn't quite yet ready to join the job market. I applied for a couple of like non-academic jobs, basically, but really wanted to do a postdoc. So I started looking for positions that would allow me to work remotely, just given the pandemic. I live in New York. My husband works in New York. I didn't really want to move again. So I started searching for things. And if you don't follow Ben Hetty on Twitter, you should definitely follow him because he posts all of the jobs. And I saw a post on there for a postdoc at VCU working with Dr. Christine Bay. So I reached out to her asking for some more information about the postdoc and whether there would be the opportunity to work remote. And I had a meeting with her beforehand because it was really important to me that I could have some flexibility in whether or not I would need to move. And once she said that there was like a 90% chance that I would be able to work remotely, I was like, okay, I'll apply. And there were a couple of other positions that I applied for as well. And I got offered the positions. I'm obviously now at VCU, and that's been really great. So I still currently live in New York for about another week or so, and then we're moving. But yeah, all of that to say, I've done 2 postdocs, and a lot of it required talking to people beforehand and getting a feel for what the position would entail, whether I would have to move or not. And, being able to talk with Christine, Dr. Bay, about what this transition would look like, because I still had projects at NYU, projects from grad school that I still needed to work on. So I am still technically a research scientist at NYU and a postdoc at VCU. And having these conversations up front, I found to be really, really helpful just to get an idea of what my workload would look like, to see the comfort level of Dr. Bay with me, still working on all these other projects that I wasn't able to wrap up because pandemic happened and halted data collection. So yeah, I definitely recommend talking with the people that you're interested in working with beforehand to see how good of a fit it will be for both yourself and the PI that you'll be working with. Cord, did I miss anything there? I feel like I talked about a lot just because my trajectory is a little strange.
Yeah, no, that's so helpful, especially just hearing from people with like different trajectories. I think it's really helpful, especially as a grad student. I feel like I don't know a lot of this until people share it. And then also thank you for sharing like coordinating with your spouse too. I think that's something that is hard to do, but maybe isn't talked about as much. So that's like really nice to hear more about your experience with that. And Dr. Kuhlman.
Unmute first. Yeah, so my postdoc is probably a little more similar to Patrick's postdoc. It is entirely research oriented and focused, although I have had a couple opportunities to teach actually at the University of Georgia where I got my PhD. So if anyone wants to talk about kind of what that's like in addition to doing a postdoc, I'm happy to chat about that. But yeah, so I mostly focus on research in my postdoc. I manage 2 NSF funded projects. So that's something that is a big part typically of postdocs. It depends. They can vary in kind of what your main purpose is, but that's kind of a big part of my postdoc is managing those projects. And then aside from management is a lot of just publishing, getting lots of papers out on all of the work that we do. And similar to Patrick, mine is like a year-long contract, but kind of we just keep really open communication, myself and my PIs, which is something that is super important. And I definitely suggest everyone to do. I think it can be kind of uncomfortable and we don't always know like how to talk about money and contracts and how long these things are going to last. And it can feel kind of awkward to just be open about that, but it's absolutely the best way to go. I have a very hard time myself with those things. And I just opened up right away with my PIs like, okay, we need to have just an open, transparent conversation about this. And it might be awkward, but I'm going to try to get better at doing these things. And it's been awesome. And they're super open to that. So anyway, we just kind of keep constant communication about what the funding looks like for my postdoc. So while I was in a 1-year contract, I was hired knowing that I would have the potential for a second year of funding if I didn't get like a tenure track position in my first year, which I did apply for. Kind of like I did like a soft search, I would say last year, mostly because I think only anyone could do a soft search. There weren't a ton of jobs. And then also I wasn't, super wildly interested because I wanted to stay in my postdoc most ideally. So anyway, so I knew I would have a second year of funding. I actually applied to a postdoc supplement funded by NSF, and I received that. So that also, so that helped me out because I actually am basically funding my own second year. And so that really firmed up a third year of funding for me. So now I'm kind of in a similar position where I know I have another year of funding if I don't get a tenure track position this round, or I don't get one that is maybe the perfect fit for me, I can again stay in my position. So postdocs are very, I'd say, kind of flexible, and they're very they're all so different, and they're really kind of what you and your PI want and make together. And so that's really important. That's why I was saying communication is just really important in a postdoc, to kind of talk about what this is going to look like, how long it's going to last, and things like that. Regarding moving, I did move. I will say I probably could have not moved, definitely for my first year. I also graduated in the middle of COVID. I graduated in summer 2020, then moved to North Carolina in August. Very similarly, it was like the weirdest time ever to move, and it was really, really tough moving to a new place. And pretty much for like the first 8 months, I only knew how to drive to the gas station, Dunkin' Donuts, and Target. So like I didn't know at all pretty much where I lived basically. So anyway, that was super tough, and obviously happy to talk about that more. But I think at the time when I was hired, we just really didn't know what was going to happen. There was definitely talk that we would go back to school or some version of face-to-face instruction. So maybe I'd work in the office, maybe not. I ended up not at all working in the office my first year. So I probably could have actually not moved. But I will say it worked out. I'm glad that I moved. But as Jessica was saying, if you want to work remote, I think more and more we are learning and realizing that we can be just as successful working remote and doing all of this project work and collaboration online. So if that's something that's important to you, I definitely think that you should inquire about it. And I think more and more folks and PIs are open to you not moving, particularly in circumstances where you have a spouse to consider and families and all these other things. So that's definitely something that you should advocate for yourself if you are interested in a postdoc and think you could do it remotely. Yeah, I think that covers it for now.
Thank you for sharing all of that, and congratulations on your NSF funding. And thank you for sharing, especially about like open communication. I know as a grad student, our contracts aren't necessarily like that. There's maybe some negotiation, but that's definitely an important like shift after you're out of grad school. And so now we'll move to our next question. What made you decide to apply for a postdoc, and were you considering other jobs?
Are we going back down in order? I can
That
start.
sounds easy for me, so share.
Perfect. So truth be told, I considered everything but a postdoc first. So I applied to R1s, I applied to R2 positions, and I applied to teaching universities. And it wasn't until about maybe like November, December of that year, 2019, that I started applying for postdocs. I had about a handful of interviews and a campus invite to a teaching university. And I needed to go to realize that that's not what I wanted. I wanted to be at an R1. So because of that, that really made me think about doing a postdoc. So that led me to where I'm at now, which has certainly prepared me better for the job market in terms of going to an R1. Yeah, I think a postdoc is really important for getting more experience in terms of research. And I realized that wasn't going to happen at a smaller teaching university if I wanted to be at an R1 with something like a 3.3 or a 4.4 load that limits your amount of time for research.
Thank you. And thank you for like connecting it to your like career goals too. That's really important.
Yeah, so I can go next. So I had kind of the opposite of Patrick in that the first time I applied for postdocs, I only applied for postdocs because I really felt like I needed more experience. My grad school experience was unusual for a number of reasons. There were some unexpected things that happened, and I just felt like I was constantly behind my peers because of those things. So I knew that I wanted to do a postdoc. I can't say I was planning on doing 2 postdocs, but once I found out that my funding from NYU was gone, I applied to some industry jobs in areas where my husband was also applying for jobs. And I would have applied to university jobs if there had been any positions open for me in the areas that my husband was also applying for. But the 2020 job market year was terrible. So there weren't a lot of options for me. And I was really happy to do this other postdoc that I'm in now. Like, I don't think of it as like a bad thing or like moving backwards in terms of my trajectory. It was an opportunity to get back to the type of research that I was really interested in. So my postdoc with Dr. Andre Simpian let me do more developmental work, which I didn't really get to do in grad school. And my specialization is in ed psych and developmental science. And, you know, doing the developmental work was really great and really, really wonderful experience in terms of research and the questions that I could ask. But I realized I really wanted to be back in a classroom working with teachers and students, which is why this postdoc with Dr. Christine Bay was a really great fit for what I wanted to do. And so, yeah, it just seemed like a really great opportunity for me, even though it might look a little strange on my CV to have like research scientist, postdoc, research scientist. Each of those, you know, were only like a year each, basically, and all really, really good experience. I think it's all about what you want to get out of the positions that you're applying to, and what makes the most sense for where you want to end up and what you want to do. And finding a postdoc position that lets you get experience that maybe you didn't get in grad school or as like a lab manager or any other position that you might have had before. So all of that to say, I wasn't really considering other jobs. I did apply to some like faculty position type jobs this year only because there were more options this year, and a good opportunity to start working on my materials because they just take a really long time to work on. And I didn't want to feel like unprepared once I like really go on the academic or industry job market.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. And I would love to hear more maybe towards the end of our discussion about how to balance working on your applications for like faculty positions while you're currently in a postdoc working full time. That seems like a lot to juggle.
So when I was applying to jobs, I feel like this is always a complex question. So when I was applying to jobs in my last year as a graduate student, I was primarily only interested in academic positions. And I would say, obviously, I continue down that path. So I am primarily only interested in academic positions, but I will say, just for like the sake of transparency, and I feel like we should talk about it more, is like getting a position in academia is more and more challenging. And so I'm also open to like industry positions or alt-ac positions is what they call them. Or even there's lots of positions that are still like at a university that's not tenure track, but where you still get to do some really cool research, particularly in learning sciences. There's a lot of opportunities for that on university campuses. So I just kind of want to like normalize that a little bit because I think sometimes we feel like academia is the only route to take. I think I chose to stay in academia for now, a lot for like representation purposes. I don't really like see a lot of people like myself a lot in academia, particularly in the fields I work in, like more cognitive areas. And then like I also do learning analytics methods. So I think for representation purposes, like I really enjoy mentoring students who look more like me or who are more like me or also feel underrepresented in these spaces. So that way they can also feel empowered to continue on into academia and doing research in these spaces. So that's a big reason I honestly have liked to stay in academia, but I'm also very open to leaving academia if I don't get a position there. So anyway, I just feel like I should put that out there because I think that we don't talk about that enough. So I did have the goal of staying in academia. And so I primarily looked at postdoc positions. And this is, again, something we maybe don't talk about enough, which is more and more it's becoming common or just like a part of your trajectory that you do a postdoc, especially if you want to stay in an R1 or R2 institution. And I would even say like teaching forward universities, the folks applying to these positions are still just super stellar researchers also, they still keep, at least at the teaching university level, like a pretty active research program going. So I would say, especially if you want to work on R1 or R2, like just kind of maybe expect to do a postdoc in a lot of ways. And that's totally okay. And much to what Jessica said, I'm so glad that I did a postdoc, because I feel much more equipped now when I take, hopefully one day, a tenure track position, that I would actually be prepared to do that. So anyway, it's been super beneficial for me. So I think if you want to stay on the R1, R2 track, kind of expect to do a postdoc, which is one reason why I mostly applied to those in my last year as a graduate student. Yeah, I think that pretty much covered that question.
Thank you for sharing that, and like explicitly saying too that postdoc is starting to become like more just like a part of the trajectory, and then also explicitly saying that it is getting harder to get jobs. So I think from being in school, we only see like tenure track faculty positions as the next step because we're in school. So thank you for sharing that. So then the next question is about, how did you find your postdocs, and do you have any tips for finding postdocs? I know we've talked a little bit about this throughout our conversation already.
I will echo what Jess said and just follow Ben Heddy. Ben Heddy is your best source. No, he does post everything on there. Like, there is nothing that will get by Ben Heddy using the EdPsych jobs hashtag. But also follow other professors just in general, because they will post postdoc ads often. So Twitter is just becoming more and more of a really good professional network. So I highly recommend that. I think for me, I probably saw mine on like higher ed jobs first. Set alerts on higher ed jobs of things that you're interested in. You can type in search words. I think I have things set on there for like educational psychology and learning sciences and STEM. So that's something to do for sure. Also, networking is important in terms of, like, I found my position on higher ed jobs, but I was also informed of this position from other colleagues and collaborators. So they had informed me that this postdoc was coming out and it might be a good fit for me. And I always think of, like, just to chat about networking for a second, like, I always feel like it has this kind of bad rap where it's like weird and uncomfortable. And I've never thought of it like that. I've always thought about just kind of like making friends at conferences. And like when I go to conferences, I see Jess and Shelbi all the time, and we chat about stuff that's not work related. And I think like that is networking. But we also chat outside of conferences often. So that's something to do. And then also something that I didn't do as much of, but somebody informed me of that I think is really beneficial, is you can search who has been funded on NSF and NIH to see who might be getting ready to hire a postdoc. So you can search keywords on NSF like STEM education. And if you see somebody like Christine Bay or DeLeon Gray or somebody who just got funding, then you can reach out to them and say, hey, I'm really interested in your work. I saw you got funded. Might you be hiring a postdoc? And even if you don't see that, I would encourage people to reach out to faculty members regardless if you're interested in their work. Everyone in the SIG has been awesome and very receptive to that. And I've never felt uncomfortable reaching out to anyone.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I hadn't thought of like looking at who has gotten grant funding. That's a really good tip.
Yeah, I'll echo basically everything that Patrick said. And I don't think I would have gotten my first position with Dr. Andre Simpian had it not been for networking, because I had reached out to him. We had some conversations. He told me there was no funding, but would let me know if something came through. And then like 6 months later, he was like, hey, I have some money. You want to come work with me? And I don't think that would have happened had it not been me reaching out to him. And I will say at AERA, I don't know, 2018, I had conversations with a lot of people about potential postdocs. And a lot of times it was super awkward because people that I talked to didn't have funding. And it was just like, hey, if you want someone to come work on your projects, I would love to. So there were a lot of like, sorry, don't have money for you type things. And it was a little awkward, but I don't think that strange of a thing. And, you know, this is one really great thing about conferences is that you get to talk with these people. So there were, I think I like had meetings or even just like walking chats with like 5 potential people that I would have loved to work with if they had had funding. So definitely recommend networking and definitely recommend Twitter, which feels so weird to say. And I was like very against getting a Twitter account. I was like, I don't need any more social media in my life. And Katie Minks and Emily Rosenslag were like, no, you should get on Twitter for academia. Like, it's really helpful. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll do it. And it has been really, really helpful. The postdocs that I applied to, I think most of them I found through Twitter or through word of mouth. So making connections with people is really, really important. And especially if you want to write a grant with someone, reaching out to them sooner rather than later, because there are some grants where faculty members can only sponsor one person. So making sure that like, if that's something you want to do, doing it early and reaching out to people. So yeah, those would be my tips is like, just don't be afraid to reach out to people. You know, the worst thing that they can say is no, which will probably happen. It happens to me quite a bit. And get on Twitter if you're not on Twitter, and follow some listservs. The CogDev Socialist Serve has usually sends postings. There's the Psych Job Wiki, which I tend not to use. It just feels a little overwhelming sometimes, but it is a good source for looking for jobs. And of course, like APA Div 15 will send out some jobs. There's lots of listservs that you can join for finding postdocs, but mainly Ben Hetty.
Thank you for sharing all that and your experiences with being told like, no, there is no funding. I think that's helpful to hear about. And if anyone is interested in learning more about creating like a social media brand for you, we did a Motivation Monday about that. And so it's up on our YouTube channel. So there's like some tips there if anyone's a little nervous about creating a academic Twitter for themselves.
I'll finish with maybe not much more to add. I mean, I think Jessica and Patrick really covered it. I will say, and I can speak to both of these experiences a little bit more as we continue to chat. So I actually had a different postdoc prior to the one I have right now. So I actually got a postdoc really early in like the job season in my last year of graduate school in like October. And then when things were more normal, and then, you know, January, the pandemic started to get more and more wild. And then by like March or April, I had actually lost the funding for that postdoc. And because it was really reliant on working in schools, which they didn't know when that was really going to be happening again. And so then it was like, you know, panic, everything is on fire, try to find any job anywhere that will take me, because I was like about to defend and everything. You know, we had like houses picked out, like we were ready to move for that postdoc, and then it didn't happen. So that was a lot. And so anyway, then I started to apply to lots of positions, a lot more postdocs, but both of those postdocs kind of covered, I think, like 2 of the main areas where you can get a postdoc, which is like more informal methods or more formal methods. So my first postdoc was super informal. I reached out to several people who I would have loved to work with. One of them was like, yeah, I got some funding. That'd be pretty cool. I went down and met with him, we chatted, and he was like, cool. So, see you here next year. Sounds great. And I'm super, super casual, and they can really be just as simple as that. And then my next round of applying for postdocs was the much more formal kind, where it was advertised. Ben Hetty tweeted it. It was advertised on, like, I think the EdPsych Jobs, on the Psych Wiki, all those typical places to look for postdoc positions. And then that was a much more formal application process where I turned in, various materials. There was kind of like a small pool that got interviews. And then I, finally, thank goodness, got the position. So anyway, if there are questions about kind of how to do that cold reaching out, super happy to chat about that. It is super worth it. And I will say, so now I work with Jeff Green and Matt Bernanke at North Carolina. And I actually reached out to both of them when I was kind of doing my cold reach outs to folks, because I knew that they just got a grant, because that's great advice. Check to see who just got funding. So I knew they just got a grant. And so I reached out to them, but they already had a postdoc, and they're like, oh, we probably won't be hiring another postdoc. Well, he actually ended up getting a position, which was very fortunate for me. But when the position opened back up and I applied to them, they were like, oh, you just cold emailed us months ago, which is a great sign, because I would say probably something I hear most from PIs is when they're looking for a postdoc, they want someone who's just really interested and cares a lot about the work, who's just really excited about the work. They want your skill set and everything too, but they want to make sure that there's a really good alignment between the work that they're doing and the work that you want to be doing. So the fact that they already knew, oh wow, she really is genuinely interested in our work, I think, kind of helped me in the more formal application pool. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's interesting to hear how even the informal, cold call kind of helped you with your more formal applications. And then we'll move on to our fourth question. So what was it like to apply for a postdoc? And what was this like during the pandemic? And then if you have any tips specifically for applying or creating a formal application and the materials with that.
For me, it was, so I had applied before things had shut down. So in terms of just process, it was fairly normal, just because we didn't know what was about to happen. But I think the big differences between applying for a postdoc and a faculty position are often less materials. So I think with a postdoc, it's usually just a cover letter for the most part. At least it was for mine. And some of the ones I've seen popping up are mostly just a cover letter right now. But I also think there are a few differences in what to put in your cover letter. As Shelbi mentioned, I think it's really important that you emphasize your interest in the project. You are being hired for a very specific reason, and it's for this project for you to work on, as well as your skill set. So I think it's important to emphasize your interest as well as the skills that you have that make you a really good candidate for this postdoc. And then I'd also just talk about the projects you've been a part of and the types of analysis you've done that make you a good fit for that, and how your research fits into the work that they're doing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I have found when applying for postdocs that sometimes they ask for lots of different things. I don't know. It's kind of weird. So there have been definitely ones that I've applied to that just ask for a cover letter, ones that I've applied to that ask for a cover letter, a research statement, and others that I've applied to that ask for a cover letter, research statement, and teaching statement. The teaching statement one is usually if the postdoc will require a lot of teaching. But usually it's either just a cover letter or a cover letter and research statement. And I've found it just like what Patrick was saying in your cover letter or research statement, talk about why you're really interested in this project, what you can bring to the project, and why this postdoc is important for your career trajectory. Because your PI also wants to make sure that this is going to be helpful for you and where you want to end up. So will this postdoc help you get an R1 position if that's what you're interested in? Will it help you develop a new skill that you maybe didn't get in grad school or in another position? So emphasizing those things and, really emphasizing your fit for the position, how your expertise can connect to the projects that you would be working on. And when I applied to the position with Dr. Bay, it was during the pandemic, which I don't know that it differed that much from the other positions that I applied for, because most of the interviews that I had for other postdocs were also through Zoom, even pre-pandemic. The biggest difference was the ability to talk about working remotely, which wasn't really even talked about as a thing before the pandemic in terms of postdoc. So during grad school, I got offered a postdoc, but it would require me to move. And I didn't really want to live apart from my husband at that time. We would have made it work if that was, my only option. But yeah, I think the ability to talk about working remote became much more popular, much more like realistic of the possibility for that. So I would say that was like really the biggest difference between pre-pandemic postdoc applications and during pandemic postdoc applications. And in terms of tips for applying or creating formal application material, ask to see other people's cover letters or research statements. It's really, really helpful. There doesn't seem to be like any specific instructions anywhere on how to do this. And it gets really confusing when a place asks for a cover letter and a research statement, like what goes in this cover letter versus what goes in the research statement. And then what happens if they only ask for a cover letter? How long should that be? What should actually go in that? So I would just reach out to your peers or other people who have gotten a postdoc position and ask if they're willing to share. My former lab mates were happy to share with me, which was really, really helpful in terms of thinking about what the structure for these should look like and what should go in them. So yeah, that would be my tips: is reach out to people, ask people to look over your materials.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. And thank you, Dr. Beymer and Dr. Gladstone, for talking about the content of the cover letters. I think that's really important. And for the explicit tip to ask other people for their materials. I think I didn't know that you could do that my first time I was applying for different funding things. It almost feels like cheating, but it's definitely not. So that's really helpful to just hear explicitly said.
Yeah, so I think all of those things, I think just maybe the biggest takeaway for what is it like to apply for a postdoc is maybe just be prepared for a range of experiences, from the informal to formal. A postdoc can come out of all sorts of things, like we talked about, just knowing folks, talking to folks at conferences, all the way to applying to something more formal that you see on a job listserv. So kind of being prepared for those various experiences, and don't shy away from either side of them. Take on all of them as you see fit. I think in particular, obviously, certainly my experience, the pandemic, for everybody, created a lot of uncertainty, and then that uncertainty, almost ruined my life, but it's fine. I'm over it now. So that was a lot, but I think if I can share some good news, I do think that overall things are getting a lot better as far as that uncertainty goes, and particularly for positions. So while of course we are still struggling with pandemic-like things in our world right now, I think all of you can look forward to a lot when people get funding and offer a postdoc position. It's probably pretty firm that funding is going to last and the postdoc position is going to last. We've also had lots of time to pivot, had to say pivot, right when the pandemic hit, and I had my position, we didn't know how to pivot at that moment. We didn't know how long things were going to last. We didn't know anything. So it was kind of hard to wrap our heads around, how could we make this work? Whereas now we've found a lot of ways where we can do online data collections and things like that. So I think even with those kind of lasting ramifications of the pandemic, we've learned a lot of ways to adapt. So I think and hope, and just putting it out into the universe for all of you, that you would not have to deal with quite that much uncertainty that us three potentially dealt with right when the pandemic started. And then some tips specifically for creating application materials. Yes to everything Jessica and Patrick said. Definitely ask for examples from peers or mentors. I asked for examples from my graduate advisor, and he was happy to share those. Email me, I'm happy to share mine. And then I think a big thing is in these materials, we tend to just it can be really easy to write fluff in these things and not a specific things. So I think that's a big thing I really had to focus on is I kind of always think about structuring a paragraph I have this skill set that fits what you want, and then provide the evidence. So I do this, and I do it because you want it. And then these are the 3 things I've done to support that. These are the 3 projects I worked on, or these are the 3 whatever certifications I got or something. So talk in specifics, talk about your specific skill set. I think that's super important. And then definitely talking about how you fit the position in ways that Jessica also mentioned. So not just, you're interested in this and you have a skill set that fits this, but also something that most PIs really want, which is great, and something that you should be looking for also is you should be learning something in your postdoc. This should really be furthering you as a scholar. So not only, there were plenty of skills that I actually did not have already for the postdoc that I'm doing right now, but they were skills I was really interested in learning. And that's something my PIs appreciated because they knew I was going to come in motivated and interested in learning these skills, gaining these skills, and then using them and applying them in the project, which is something they're looking for. So what you're interested in, how your current skills fit it, and then also what skills you're expecting to learn and gain, and then how you will apply those in the future. I think those are all important things to include.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that, especially even the structure of the paragraph. That's really helpful because it is easy to write fluff. And yeah, thank you for bringing acknowledging just the uncertainty that the pandemic has brought and how really difficult that has been for a lot of people. I think especially people that graduated during that time and people didn't know, and there's hiring freezes. So thank you for saying that as well. And so I think we've talked a bit about this throughout all the questions, but what has been your experience during your postdoc? And I know there, sorry.
It's okay. I don't know. No, it's good. It was certainly weird at first during the pandemic, right? As Jess and Shelbi can attest to. I didn't go on campus for the first years. I moved, as Shelbi mentioned, I probably could have just stayed in East Lansing because every meeting I had was online. I never stepped foot in my building. It was definitely a little isolating. Luckily, we had met some neighbors who were students and postdocs and things like that. So as Madison started to open back up a little bit, we were able to engage with the city more, which I don't regret at all. I love Madison a lot. So I'm happy I moved here. But definitely just weird to start like that and not ever see your PI's face in person, really. I think I met with Judy once to as soon as I got here, the week that I got here, to go for a walk in a park, and we talked outside. And then I hadn't seen her again until the beginning of this year. But as I mentioned, it's been really research focused. So, which is great. I love that. And I think, I guess I'll lean into a little bit of the next question as well. I think it's been good to bite off a piece of that research for myself and have something that I am specifically working on. So that has made it really good for me. And as Shelbi mentioned, I've learned a lot in this postdoc because I had never done intervention work before. So that was really good for me. And then the other thing I'll just quickly note is trying to fit in time for other projects with other collaborators. You do your dissertation and then it doesn't disappear. You still want to work on that and you have data and you want to get papers out and you want to form other collaborations because you're building a career. So I try to do as much of that as I have time for, which often means working an hour or two on the weekends to fit some of that in, but it's stuff that I really enjoy. So I like doing that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And maybe we can kind of sneak the last question in with this one, since we have talked about experiences a lot. So tips for getting the most out of your postdoc. So maybe talking about both of those in tandem would be good.
Yeah, so I will say the postdoc that I had at NYU and the postdoc that I have currently at VCU are two pretty different experiences. So my postdoc at NYU was basically a 7-day-a-week working. And part of that was I was doing data collection with kids on the weekends. And during the week was writing and other research time. So it was really good experience for me. I hadn't done data collection with children. I had done data collection with middle school, high school, and college students. Very different sample from young children. And so my weekends were usually spent at a zoo or a museum collecting data and then trying to find time for my other writing and research projects. My postdoc at VCU, I don't really do any of the actual data collection because I'm not there. I'm remote, but I do have a lot of the duties of like setting up the data collection, what will happen, meeting with teachers, and those sorts of things around data collection, but I don't actually go to the classrooms because I'm not in the area. And I will say with this postdoc at VCU with Christine, we had a very open and honest conversation up front before I even took the position about what my hours would look like, which I didn't do for the NYU position, because at that time I was just like so thankful to get a position in the same area as my husband that I was going to take it no matter what, basically. And it was a really, really good experience. And I'm glad that I took it. But it gave me a lot of like, here are the questions I need to ask if I'm going to do another postdoc. What will my hours look like? What will I actually be working on and expected to do? And where's the flexibility with the projects that I want to work on? And Christina is really wonderful with all of those things. She, broke down my expected hours. And of course, those can change based on the needs of the project. So some weeks I'm definitely more project heavy with trying to set up meetings with teachers, and things like that. But other weeks, I have a lot of flexibility. I'm working on my own projects. Like Patrick said, you finish your dissertation, but it doesn't disappear. You have papers that you want to publish from it, especially if you didn't do like a 3-paper dissertation, which is becoming more common now, which didn't exist when I was in grad school at Maryland at the time. So all that to say, at NYU, I didn't really have time for collaborations because I had all these other projects that I was basically taking over when I joined as a postdoc. But at VCU, I have a number of collaborations, with Christine and other people that she's working with, and then my own projects that I want to do. So yeah, pretty different in terms of like work expectations. And I definitely suggest having that conversation up front about those expectations. Because being a postdoc, you have a lot of skills that you can apply that are really helpful for the PI that you're working with. And, you're obviously going to be very excited about the projects that you're working on, but taking time to work on your own stuff is really important as well. So yeah, definitely talk with your PI and have meetings with your PI if you're feeling overwhelmed with things. I think we all have a tendency to underestimate the time it will take to do things, and making sure that your PI is okay if things take longer than needed.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. And the tip to have those conversations beforehand about expectations is helpful.
So I think I will maybe kind of tie those things together by talking about something we haven't talked about as much yet with a postdoc, which is like mentorship or advising that comes from your PI. I mean, very similar to graduate school, like the PI or PIs who advise you as a postdoc can really kind of make or break your postdoc. So I think that is something that is really, really important when interviewing, reaching out to folks. Make sure that they also fit your expectations as far as advising and mentorship goes. A lot of people, I think, kind of think, or there's like kind of a lot of assumptions that like a postdoc is like you just get hired and you kind of like go off into your own office and like no one sees you and you never come out again or something, or hopefully you come out with like 20 papers later or something. That hasn't happened for me yet, but fingers crossed it does. But anyway, it's not really supposed to be like that. You know, I have regular mentorship meetings with my advisors. We have weekly project meetings. We have lab meetings. Like I talk with them a lot and they aid in my development as a scholar a lot. And in addition to those things is that they really do care about your development as a scholar. So of course, they care about you working on the project and doing the things you're supposed to do, meeting your tasks, providing deliverables and stuff, but also they really want you to grow in that experience. And something that Jessica and Patrick have both spoken to is what's a part of that growing as a scholar is really growing into your own independent scholar. So really kind of getting your own line of work going that's independent even from them and your graduate mentor. That's something that's really important and something that they should be advocating for. So like when I started my position, Matt, Jeff, and I spoke, and like we dedicated like a day a week goes to working on my dissertation, working on other projects from graduate school, working on collaborations that I've developed after graduate school, but just really kind of working on my own thing. So that way I really am kind of establishing myself as an independent scholar. So that's something that's super important. It's an important experience to have, and it's also a pro tip for just making sure that you do get that experience in your postdoc. And that's definitely something like when I was interviewing with folks, that was a question I had for them was, you know, how much time am I going to be allowed to kind of work on my own stuff, work on my own projects? How much room is there in this position for me to work on those things? So it's totally okay to expect that. You absolutely should expect that and ask about it and be open about that. So yeah, I think that's important. And I think too, just I'd say overall is just getting the opportunity. I think something that's phenomenal about a postdoc is it's really been a great opportunity to get experience not being a graduate student anymore without fully being a PI. So I get to kind of dabble in all the PI things. I get to help mentor the doctoral students in the lab, which is great. But I'm also not like sitting on their dissertation committees yet. You know, I'm not ready for that. So it's like you kind of get to dabble in these things. I've gotten to work on writing some smaller grants, building and fostering some collaborations that aren't, you know, full across the nation giant grants yet. So really kind of getting that experience not being a graduate student, not just so focused on your dissertation, but kind of building out from that without having the full on responsibilities of a PI. That's been super great. And that's why I've taken advantage of opportunities when I've been offered to teach a course. I've taken that. So I got a semester where I really experienced what it was like to teach a course and do the research and be mentoring some students. So really take advantage of that opportunity to be kind of like a mini PI and make sure that's something that you want to do before you kind of continue to pursue an R1 or R2 position. So I think that's a really great part of being a postdoc and something to take advantage of.
Yeah, thank you for sharing too, to like explicitly talk about doing your own research. For myself, I didn't know that was part of a postdoc until someone explicitly told me that. I thought it was you just like go disappear, do their work and like live your life. So thank you for sharing that. So now we'll move into some of the audience questions that we got throughout the session. So we talked a little bit, I think, about if it's common. So we answered that one. And I think we answered like, how did you get the position, about internal connections? But if anyone has follow-up questions to those two questions, please feel free to put those in the chat and we can return to them. But here's a question that I think we've kind of like talked about, and maybe not explicitly. I think Dr. Kuhlman, you pointed this out too, that we don't explicitly talk about it. But what was your stress level when you are uncertain about whether you'll get a tenure track position during your postdoc? How does the sense of constant uncertainty implicate your research and mental well-being? They also added, feel free to not share if you don't feel comfortable talking about that. So just whatever you're comfortable with sharing. Definitely a heavy question, but
It's high.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the first, I mentioned previously, I did apply to tenure track positions last year, but I knew I had a second year of funding. It just there weren't a lot of jobs. I think my heart was really in it, which was fine. This semester, I'm happy to share that, now, and I don't know if this is Jessica and Patrick's experience too, but now we have experience under our belt and we have more publications and we have more of this, that, and the other. And it starts to feel like I'm a more competitive candidate now. And especially there's been a lot more jobs coming out. So I know for me, like my expectations are definitely a lot higher this semester in a way that I didn't expect, which has also made like the emotional and mental and stressful turmoil a little bit higher too, because I find myself kind of really getting hopeful and excited about these positions, still very well knowing that there's a bunch of great candidates also on the market, and it is still highly competitive, and there's a chance I don't get any of them. And it's been a lot. I can certainly say October was a big due date month, and October was rough emotionally. And the biggest thing I can say to help with that is find your people, find folks. I think we're really fortunate. I feel really fortunate to be in like the EdSite community. I think we're like a very open overall, a very open, kind, compassionate community. And I know I can lean on people like Jessica and Patrick, and we can kind of share in these feelings together. So I think that's my biggest tip, is everyone's kind of going through it. And I imagine that they also feel very similarly, and talking about it and being open about it, it is the way to go. And I feel fortunate to be in a community where I feel like I can do those things. So yeah, definitely don't, cry in your corner. Let's at least all cry together or something like that.
I can echo Shelby here a little bit. I mean, it's definitely high, but as Shelby mentioned, we're in a better position as postdocs. And once you send off those materials, I try to remind myself it's out of my hands now. So once I send it off, I try not to think about it as hard as that is, because the waiting is without a doubt the worst piece of being on the job market. And then if you have interviews, the same thing. I try to remind myself, like, I've prepared, I've done everything I possibly can do, and it's up to them now. And that's really truly what it is. And you never know, you don't know who else is on the market. You don't know what exactly they're looking for anyway. So there's a job ad that says that, but there could be other things happening behind the scenes. So you just have to really prepare as much as you can. And that, I think, helps with the stress a little bit. And as Shelby mentioned, like, the community in the EdPsych world is great. It's a lot of support. So it feels good to be supported.
Yeah, I'll echo all of that. It is stressful. When I was in my first postdoc and I found out that my funding was getting pulled, that was really, really stressful. It got pulled at a time when a lot of the positions had already passed. So I was limited in what I could apply for. The nice thing about postdoc positions is sometimes they're kind of on a rolling basis depending on funding. So there's usually like 2 main times when a lot of these positions come out, and it's usually around grant awarding season. So for a few months there, I was really, really stressed. I was pretty sure I wasn't going to have a job for the next at least semester. And I applied to a number of different postdocs, and thankfully I got a postdoc, another postdoc, but it was really, really stressful. And this year I did start applying for faculty positions, but pretty selectively. So only at universities that my husband was also applying to, which I think has helped a little bit, in that I have funding for at least another year. So I don't have to get a job this year. I still have time to build my CV, which is going to be really helpful. I have a lot of things that are close to like being ready to submit and things under review. And my hope is by next year, when I'm like really on the job market, those things will be out, fingers crossed. But all that to say, it is really stressful, and just know that you're not going to be alone. At our writing group that we have, we talk about these things a lot. Gotten a lot of support. I looked over other people's materials who I know are applying to the same jobs as me. And that also makes it difficult because your friends are applying to the same jobs as you, and you really want them to get a job, but you also want to get a job as well. So it just is, it's a strange process, but know that you're not alone. And I've heard other people, when they're like in the thick of putting together job materials, that they dedicate like one day to job material days so that their other time can be for research and things like that. Because you don't want the job process to be all consuming, the only thing that you can work on. You need to make sure you're having time for the other things that you enjoy doing. Not that putting together job materials isn't fun, but it's not that fun. I'll be honest, it's not that fun. It is a really weird process. And again, ask for people to see their materials, especially for faculty positions, because those cover letters and research statements and teaching statements and things like that differ from what you put together for a postdoc. So ask around, ask for feedback, ask to give practice talks, and even ask to give practice talks if you're applying for a postdoc and they want you to give a presentation in their lab. For the 2 postdoc positions that I got, I had to give presentations in both of those labs. You know, one I had already gotten the position, so that like the presentation wasn't that stressful, but for the one at BCU, that was a little bit more stressful because there were other applicants. And so I really wanted to make sure that this presentation that I was putting together, you know, could map onto the work that I would be doing, and getting feedback from other people about the presentation and the length, and does this make sense to people? Because, you know, these job talk presentations, you're having to present on quite a bit of your work, but you don't have that much time to do it. So yeah, all of that to say, the stress will be high, but you'll get through it. We all get through it. And especially the MOTSIG community is so wonderful in terms of helping people with materials, giving feedback, you know, providing support, you know, reach out to people. We have our Slack channel. I blow that thing up like every other day asking questions. I feel like, sorry, everyone. But people respond, and chances are other people have had those same questions. So don't be afraid to reach out to people, and happy to share things, give feedback, look at things.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing, especially the coping like strategies that you use too. I think that's really helpful to hear and important for all of us. One thing I'll add too, so like with Dr. Gladstone's presentation, as a student, I went to that to like see, and so kind of like there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for students to kind of see the job process. But also I know as students we're really, really busy, but sometimes going to those is really helpful to like see what might be expected of you in the future. And so we have another question in the chat, which is, when did you start looking for positions? And I think we've started to touch a little bit on this, but is there a season relative to grant awarding, which I think Dr. Gladstone, you mentioned, or is it just kind of all the time for these postdocs?
I saw that question trying to think of when I got the interview for the position. I want to say, I remember it being cold. So I think I had interviewed sometime in the winter. But it does seem like for postdocs that it's pretty variable. There does seem to be like times where they're coming out a lot, like, I don't want to say right now, but like a October-ish time in the early fall, people will start posting them. In the spring, people will post them to start for next year. But again, it is dependent on funding. So this is why I think it's really important to reach out to people and network with people, because if maybe they haven't heard about funding yet, but like in Shelbi's case, she had already emailed the people that she's working with now, and they didn't have anything at the time, but once they got something, they were like, oh, we know her. She was interested in this project, and the same thing happened to me with the NYU position. At the time when I talked with Andre, he didn't have any funding for me. And then, some funding opened up, and I was the first person he reached out to because we had already had conversations about working together. So yeah, I can't say that there's like a season per se. It does seem to be pretty variable, but Shelbi and Patrick, feel free to correct me. But yeah, I'm like, can't even think of when I got this interview. It feels like 1,000 years ago, partially because of the pandemic, but
Yeah, I would say, so I think there's so a lot of people hear about grant decisions in spring, like around February, March or so. So I think in fall is like a common time for a postdoc where they heard about funding the prior spring. So like, you'll hear about postdocs then, but then you can also hear about postdocs late into spring because they just got word that their funding got approved, and now they're looking to hire a postdoc, as soon as possible to start in summer or that same August. So I think there's kind of like the two waves. It's kind of like fall, all of fall, and then like mid to late spring. But I would say, especially for postdocs, like if you don't even have, I guess I didn't get my current position until June, April, late April. So I would say like if you're getting something, and I've heard other folks too in postdocs who got something that late. So obviously that can be kind of scary if you're close to graduating. It's like, what's going to happen? But if you have any flexibility, like I was able to, like I postponed my defense by 2 months. If you're able to do stuff like that, do those things. That's something that helped me when I lost my first position, then got a second one. But yeah, I would say, really you can get a postdoc pretty late. Like some people, put one out and they're looking for someone to start as soon as possible. It's very different than the tenure track job search, which really kind of does have like a season. And if you haven't heard anything by April, then you probably definitely did not get anything. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's all my experience as well. The only thing I would say that has a season is if you are looking to apply for like an NSF postdoc or some sort of funding source, there are specific deadlines for that. So keep an eye on those. And then the only other thing I'll add is if a postdoc comes out in the fall and you're not going to graduate until the spring, like don't be afraid to reach out to that person and say, like, I am not graduating until the spring or the summer, but I'm very interested in this. Is there a possibility to delay the start date? Because that's our cycle generally. Generally, we see graduate students graduate in the spring, not all the time, but that's the academic market. So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out and ask about those things.
Great. Thank you all for sharing your answers to that question. And then for our final question, is there anything else that you'd like to share today that you haven't talked about at all?
I have one thing, and I put this in the chat, but I think it is really important to talk with the PI, if possible, before you apply, to learn more about the project and what your role would be. And then to also talk with the current people in the lab. Being a postdoc can be isolating sometimes because you're no longer a grad student, and you're not a faculty member, you're kind of in between these two things. So talking with the people who are currently working with the PI and seeing, like, is there a sense of community in this lab? Will I be able to work with other people? Is there collaboration happening? You know, what is the general sense here? You know, will the PI advise me, or will I just be expected to come in and do the work that they like want done? You know, what is the relationship going to be like? So for example, in the lab I'm in now with Christine Bay, there's a lot of collaboration. You know, I'm working on some of Lauren's projects. He's in here now. Lauren's working on some of my projects. At NYU, there wasn't a lot of collaboration. It was a lot of people working on their own projects. There was still like a lot of lab support. You know, everyone was expected to give presentations and give feedback on everybody's projects and things like that, but not a lot of collaboration happening. So it's really, I think, really important to find out what the culture is like in the lab. What are the expectations? What is work-life balance like in the position that you're at? Will it be a good fit for you? Will it be a good like mental space for you? What are you going to get out of it, and what can you contribute to it? I think all of those things are really important to consider. You know, I know a postdoc is temporary, but it's still potentially 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 years of your life. And you want to make sure that you're working with someone who's going to support you and that you can also support.
Yeah, I think everything Jess said is really, really important. At the end of the day, your PI and your advisor have their jobs already. So I think it's really important that you think about yourself a little bit, be a little bit selfish, and think, what do I need, and what is going to help me get to where I want to be? So even in grad school and with my postdoc, I've taken good and bad experiences and use that to think about how I want to run my lab. So I think all of that contributes. But yeah, I think it's really important to think about what is best for you in a postdoc.
I'll just finish out by saying kind of similarly, just use your postdoc to learn as much as possible. Sorry, my dog might start barking at a lady walking outside the window. Something I didn't really ever think about, but I actually also learn a lot of the ways like academia and higher education work in my postdoc. So like I go to faculty meetings, even though I'm not technically faculty yet. And that's something that's really important to my PIs that I do. And that's been super beneficial for me, particularly like if I'm a first generation college student, like if you are also higher ed and academia is just like this black box of like what in the world goes on. And I have learned so much to help prepare me for when I am a faculty member, that instead of spending my first year or 2 years trying to run to catch up on what are the policies, what are the standards, what's tenure like, what are all these other things like, instead of having to catch up on that, I'm doing a lot of that now. So that way, when I hopefully start a faculty position, I will be ready and know those things. So stuff like that is something you don't think about very much, but actually has really been invaluable to really learn about. So just, yeah, I mean, echoing what Jessica and Patrick have said, just use this opportunity to learn as much as you can about what it's going to be like to be a tenure track faculty member.
Yeah, thank you all for those like takeaways. I think it is really important to think about how that postdoc is going to serve you in your career, because it can definitely be easy. I mean, I guess I don't know at this point, but I'm sure it can be easy to kind of lose sight of that when you're asked to do so many things. And so that'll bring us to our last part of today's discussion. We don't have a lot of time, but we're going to have a Jamboard, and everyone can feel free to add some of the tips they either learned today that stuck with them, or some other tips and strategies that they know for applying for postdocs. And there'll be a link in the chat for that Jamboard. Feel free to use the 5 minutes we have left, or if you want to just sit on what we've learned today for a little bit and add. It'll be nice this way we can share notes with people, and we can all take it away together. And then also feel free to tweet a key takeaway that you have. You can use our hashtag that we came up for Motivation Mondays, which is hashtag AERA Motivation Monday. And then the very last thing is that we will have another Motivation Monday next month. And so we just want to thank our panelists and thank you for everyone who engaged in this discussion. So we hope we see you in the future Motivation Mondays, but thank you all so much and have a nice rest of your week. It's Monday, so it's the beginning, but thank you all.